I would like to welcome Uncle Colin to do the Welcome to Country.
Thanks, Professor. It's always an honour for me to be asked to do a Welcome to Country at the functions at the university or wherever it is. It shows to me that it gives respect and recognition of the traditional owners. Today, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Anaiwan people, whose country we meet on today, and we share the caring of this country with the Gumbaynggirr, Dunghutti and Kamilaroi people. Let us pay respect to the elders past and present of those nations, and I extend that same respect to each of you today, and welcome. Thank you.
Can I just say, as an aside, as a non-Aboriginal person, I had the honour 2 years ago to be in the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, and I was meant to be giving a talk on the internet and the law. And I started my presentation by saying, if I was in Australia, I would say something to this effect. The next 20 minutes was trying to explain something of the 60,000 plus year history. We are an amazing country, and the more we understand, the more I think we will have a greater harmonisation. And I really thank you, Uncle Colin, for your time and the other elders who I know support us on campus. And I hope we can do more in our curriculum, to be honest. So I might talk about that a little bit later. Thank you very much for coming. And I'll keep my comments pretty brief because you really want to hear the Honourable Michael Kirby. But we're very pleased that with a very busy schedule on the first week of a new job, our new Vice-Chancellor, Professor Bridget Heywood, is here today. So Bridget, thank you very much for coming. Well, yes, please acknowledge it. I only arrived on the 2nd of January and there wasn't that many people around. I was able to walk around in shorts and a t-shirt while I got my things. The Vice-Chancellor, believe me, has to hit the ground running with many events. And I'm so pleased that A, that she was able to be here, but also tomorrow night we have our law ball, and I'm really excited that she's able to find time for that as well, which is just amazing. We also have our Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost of campus, so Todd Walker, Professor Todd Walker, welcome. And we have a range of apologies. I'm going to keep them short. But the Honourable Barnaby Joyce was coming and unfortunately has been called away, and so the federal member for this area, and the Honourable Adam Marshall, of course, is our state member. And my Dean of the Science, Agriculture, Business and Law, Sable, Professor Aaron Murphy, is actually in Sydney for the next couple of days, and he sends his formal apologies as well. Well, what can I say about Honourable Justice Michael Kirby, one of the longest serving judges? We all know him from the High Court, the President of the Court of Appeal, the Law Reform Commission, and on it goes. Well, I had the pleasure of first meeting Michael in 1997 when I was the president of the Australasian Law Teachers Association, and we had a conference and he came and very generously spoke. We had different levels of the court system. But it wasn't until I had the pleasure of then becoming the Dean at the University of Western Sydney, as it was called, and Justice Kirby came, and for the first time I understood what a rock star he is in the legal world. So many students wanted their selfies. But in fact, one of the generosities of Mr. Kirby is that his last associate in the High Court was actually a UWS graduate called Leonie Young, who he also supported for a scholarship to study overseas. And he very generously invited us down to chambers in the High Court to understand and acknowledge Leonie's work. And I know you've stayed in contact with Leonie, as you have many other people. And in fact, one of the nicest treasures I have is a photograph His Honour took in those chambers of Leonie, my deputy, and myself, and immediately sent it through. Your passion and support and your drive. I cannot think of a better person to come and speak on the particular topic we're discussing today. And as you may or may not know, that in fact, His Honour was invited by the Pope to go and talk on this topic and be engaged in a discussion. And we're all dying to understand why. Please make His Honour welcome for the Kirby Lecture.
Thank you, Margaret. Let me also acknowledge the Indigenous people of this land and the Indigenous people across our continental country, from one side of Australia to the other. Great wrongs have been done to the Indigenous people of Australia, and they require correction. And many of the wrongs were done by the law, and they require correction. And law schools and lawyers have a very special reason to be committed to correcting the wrongs, because those wrongs deprive the Indigenous people of access to their most precious of assets, their land. And that was not corrected by the elected parliament of this democratic country. It was corrected by the 7 justices of the High Court of Australia. And I'd like everyone in this audience to remember that when you hear people say, we don't need a Bill of Rights, it would give power to unelected judges. Sometimes you need a symphony of sound, which includes the sound of justice ringing in everybody's ears, and sometimes the unelected judges marching to a different drum have an important message to give to a nation about where justice lies. And so I think it's right that we in Australia should begin to get better at acknowledging country. We can learn from the New Zealanders in this respect. And I thank you for the welcome to the country. I acknowledge the Indigenous people of this land and that we have many things to learn from them. And I know that in the law school of the University of New England, new initiatives are planned in concert with the situation of Indigenous people in other countries that were colonised, to examine the ways in which we can learn from them, and maybe sometimes they can learn from our passion and dedication to improving things in Australia. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Bridget Heywood, freshly minted Vice-Chancellor of the University of New England. The University of New England was actually the first university that I ever really had a lot to do with after Sydney University, where I received my university education. And I came up here during the chancellorship of Sir Frank Kitto, who was a Justice of the High Court of Australia, and the university continues during the time of Vice-Chancellor Ron Gates. I gave a graduation address here, and Ron Gates, who was a very distinguished economist who'd actually taught me economics when I did an economics degree after my law degree at the University of Sydney, and he succeeded Sir Zelman Cowen. Now, Zelman later came to work with me in the Law Reform Commission because we got a project on the protection of privacy. And Zelman had given his Boyer lectures on the private man. And he was a wonderful scholar. He was a great lawyer. He was a fine Vice-Chancellor of this university. He became Vice-Chancellor of the University of Queensland. And then he was appointed the Governor-General, the Queen's representative in Australia. And that was at a time he was serving in the Law Reform Commission. And I remember meeting him very soon after he was appointed Governor-General, and he had with him the decorations that he had received from the Queen as a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. I had companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, CMG was Call Me God, KCMG was Kindly Call Me God, and GCMG was God Calls Me God. And Zelman had the GCMG, and I got on a Qantas jet going down to Canberra, and he had his decoration with him, and he couldn't be stopped from going up to the cabin above his seat and getting down this decoration, which was a most magnificent display of gold and jewellery, and that was Zelman. He was a man of endless enthusiasms and a very fine Vice-Chancellor, very proud of his association with the University of New England. He died about 5 years ago, and in a few weeks' time, on the 7th of October, it is Zelman's centenary. He actually was born on the very day that Alfred Deakin, one of the founders of the Australian Commonwealth, died. And he used to constantly tell the story that he felt that the spirit of Alfred Deakin had moved into him at the moment of his death, which seemed to me a somewhat Dalai Lama-like view of life and death. But it made Zelman terribly happy. And I wrote a letter on Monday of this week to Lady Cowan, Anna Cowan, who is his widow. And I apologise that I couldn't get to a function, but I pointed out that it's not actually being held on that precious day, the 7th of October, but I said I'm going to the University of New England, and I know Zelman really loved his years at UNE and in Armidale, and it wouldn't be a bad idea if the Vice-Chancellor, to one of her distinguished predecessors, were to send to Lady Cowan a bouquet of flowers on the 7th of October to remember, on behalf of the citizens of Australia in Armidale at UNE, the life of a very distinguished Australian who gave time as Vice-Chancellor. And who knows, Vice-Chancellor, you may move on. The spirit may enter you, and you may end up in Yarralumla in Canberra. So good luck to you. And I'm sure Lady Cowan would want to send greetings to everybody here on behalf of the Cowan family. Now, this talk today is divided, like Caesar's Gaul, into 3 parts. The first part is a talk about the relationship between religion and sexuality. The second part will be a talk about my visit to the Vatican on the 5th of April of 2019. And the third part will be a reflection upon the outcome of that visit and upon its possible relevance for the issue which is before the Australian community today and is going to be more before the Australian community because of the demands that are being made by some in Australia for greater protection for religious freedoms and how we as citizens should respond to that demand. First, the issue of sexuality and religion. It's been an uncomfortable ride, and it's an uncomfortable ride because of a very few passages in the scriptures of the Abrahamic religions, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. The common books of the Old Testament reflect a disquiet that the ancient philosophers and rabbis in Judaism felt about what they considered to be the unnatural and unacceptable conduct of sexual activity between people of the same gender. That feeling of disquiet originated basically in the body parts of human beings. The fact that men had penises, women had vaginas, and that for the procreation of children, those body parts were suitable for use with each other, but not suitable for use separately. And so developed thinking in the Abrahamic religions that the body parts, the penis and the vagina, were not only suitable for, but only suitable for procreation of children. And that was what sex was there for, and its use for any other thing, such as pleasure, love, intimacy, kindness, responsiveness, was immaterial. What was material, and only material, was what they were there for, which was making children. There are passages in the book of Genesis and in the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament that say words to the effect, if a man lies with a man as with a woman, then that is an abomination, and surely they shall be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. And from that passage in the Old Testament came the consideration by the Jewish religion that homosexual activity by a man with a man or a woman with a woman, or by that group of people who are bisexual or intersex or transgender, was totally forbidden and must not happen, and was very seriously forbidden and must be punished so that it is stamped out. Everywhere that the British planted their flag, they introduced a criminal law. That's what you do if you establish an empire. And the criminal law always had provisions punishing and seriously punishing sexual activity between people of the same gender. That punishment originally was the death penalty, and more people were hanged for sodomy in England in the 1830s and 1840s than were hanged for murder. It was a wildfire of punishment. This had also been the law in France and other countries of Europe, but when the French Revolution came along, in 1791, the Estates General in Paris said, "This is rubbish. This is just superstition. This has got nothing to do with the criminal law. So long as the people are adults, so long as what they do is in private, so long as they give consent, the law should mind its own business." And so the French abolished the criminal law based on the text in Leviticus in 1791. And the consequence of that was, in every country where the tricolour flew, there was no criminal law against gays. And in the whole of the French Empire, and in the Spanish Empire, and in the German domains and empire, and in the Scandinavian empires, and in Russia, which was based on the German code, and in China, which was based on the French code, and in Japan, which was based on the German code, there was no criminal offence. But everywhere the Union Jack ever flew, there was a criminal law against gays and very severe punishments. Those criminal laws still exist to this day. They exist in most Islamic countries. They exist in most Commonwealth countries. There are 54 countries in the Commonwealth of Nations, and of the 54, 32 still have criminal laws against gay sex. And people are greatly punished, and every attempt to get them to remove these laws comes to nothing, because the politicians say, if we advance that idea, we will be defeated in the election, so we're not going to do it. And this is so right up to the present time. It's very difficult to get rid of those laws through elected parliaments. Sometimes, as last year in India, the Supreme Court of the country, applying the Constitution of India and provisions in the Constitution of India, upholding the equality of all people all citizens in India, and upholding human dignity, was upheld in India last year to strike down the criminal law in India. So millions of people overnight, as a result of the decision of the Indian Supreme Court, were suddenly liberated from this relic of the colonial times. The British got rid of the law in 1967. There was a big fuss a few weeks ago, you probably heard, about Stonewall. Stonewall was a rather downbeat and definitely unsophisticated and inelegant gay bar in Christopher Street in Soho in New York. And that was a place where the police usually sent a phone call before they raided the place. But one time they didn't send the phone call, they raided the place and began arresting the gay people who were in there having a quiet drink. And the result was that for the first time, this group of downbeat New York druggies, sex workers, and transgender people, they rebelled and they started to fight back. And the consequence of that was that they locked the police in the gay bar. And not only did they do that, but the ultimate humiliation was that the drag queens who had been amongst the beer sippers in the hotel did a can-can outside the bar and called out insults to the police officers inside. So this was something that hit the headlines in New York on the basis that the police couldn't even arrest a group of fairies, that the fairies were fighting back. But that is, in the United States, the time from which the Americans think the whole business of gay liberation dated. Americans are so self-centered. Everything has to happen in the United States. Well, as one professor of law from Ghana pointed out, the British had got rid of that law in 1967. And this was 1975 when Stonewall happened. And at about that time, the first of the laws in Australia was repealed in South Australia. South Australia, as you know, is terribly proud. Unlike Tasmania and unlike New South Wales and unlike Queensland and Victoria and Western Australia, they had no convicts. They're very proud of that in South Australia. They had lots of German migrants in South Australia, very serious people in South Australia. They were the first to get rid of the laws in South Australia. Mind you, it was 2 centuries after the French had got rid of it, but it was still the first time it had been removed in Australia, and it was then removed one by the different states of Australia. And why was it removed? It was removed not because of Stonewall, it was removed because of research and because of a Vice-Chancellor. It was removed because of the research of Alfred Kinzie. Alfred Kinzie was a world expert on bees. He was the world expert on gall wasps. He had millions of samples of gall wasps. And suddenly, for a reason that isn't entirely understood, in the late 1930s, he changed the focus of his study from bees to human beings. And he began studying the sexual lives of human beings. Astonishingly, that had not been much researched before. There had been some research, but not much. But Kinzie adopted it as his magnificent obsession. But most importantly, the Vice-Chancellor called the President at Indiana University in the United States, a campus rather like UNE, a country, rural, regional centre. They happened to have a Vice-Chancellor named Herman Wells. He actually played a big part in the foundation of UNESCO after the Second World War. But the Cardinal Archbishop of Indianapolis said, "This must be stopped. This is contrary to the instruction of the Church. We will get our members of Parliament, members of the state legislature, to take the money away if they go on with Dr. Kinzie's research." And Herman Wells said, if what Dr. Kinzie is doing is legitimate research and scientific research, it will be done at the University of Indiana, and I don't care what the Cardinal Archbishop of Indianapolis said about it. And so they went on with it. And I met Herman Wells before he died, and I served on the board of the Kinzie Institute, and they're still at it, looking at the issues of sex, not from the point of view of scripture, but from the point of view of what actually happens, empirical data, science. And that's why things began to change. And that's why things began to change in Australia, because empirical data and scientific inquiry showed that a certain proportion of human beings, not many, but about the same as Indigenous people in Australia, about 1 or 2%, maybe more, maybe 5% in the case of sexuality, are lifelong, unchanging, unchangeable sexual orientation to their own gender. And of course, in science and in nature, if a thing exists, it generally exists for a purpose. Otherwise, it would be bred out of the human species. So it's there, it's a fact, and people began to say, well, why are we punishing these people? Why are we doing this? Oh, it's in the scriptures. But is that what the scriptures actually meant? Were they trying to get over some other message when they wrote what they did 3,000, 2,000 years ago? And so this is the story of how this conflict between some people's understanding of the instruction of Scripture and the increasing work of Alfred Kinzie and Evelyn Hooker and all the other scientists who've actually researched it, how they came into conflict and how that conflict had to be resolved. I am now serving, after my period on the High Court and inquiry into North Korea, which I spoke about in this hall last time I was here, I think, I'm now serving on the Human Rights Institute of the International Bar Association. The International Bar Association is the biggest organisation of lawyers on the planet. It has members in virtually every country, and it has a Human Rights Institute mainly to look at the issues of human rights that affect lawyers. Cases of judges being oppressed, as in Turkey, cases of advocates being oppressed, as in China, cases of legal academics being oppressed. All of these matters are under constant vigilant attention of the IBA. But in 2011, the IBA, like most of the big world human rights organisations, adopted a resolution which declared that the IBA was opposed to criminalisation of same-sex activity, and that ought to be removed from the criminal law. And since that time, I was not much involved in the passage of that resolution in 2011, but since that time, the IBA has been trying to get countries to remove the criminal laws that still exist in the 32 countries of the 54 countries of the Commonwealth of Nations. Very hard thing to get done. But the IBA became very interested in strategy. What strategy can you adopt that will get things changed? And one of the strategies that was proposed to us by a lawyer from Argentina was that we should approach the Pope in order to secure the support of Pope Francis for a statement that the criminal laws against gay people should be removed in every country, that it wasn't required, and it wasn't required specifically by Catholic doctrine. The lawyer in Argentina had reason to do that because, as you know, Pope Francis, before his elevation to the See of St. Peter, was the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and he was and is an Argentinian. He was the first Pope elected from outside of Europe, certainly in centuries. And so our colleague from Argentina, conducting soundings, said, this is a timely thing to do. When Pope Francis was elected, it came as a bit of a shock to him. And he didn't have his toothbrush and all the other things. They were back in Argentina. So he had to go back to Argentina to collect his humble belongings. He was the first Jesuit Pope ever elected to the See of St. Peter. And so he got on a plane, went back to Argentina, and then he took the plane back to Rome to take up his position. And as happens nowadays, when he was on the plane going back to Rome, he held a press conference on the plane. And one of the questions that he was asked was, well, there's a lot of talk about homosexuals and sexual orientation. What do you think about it? And Pope Francis's answer was, who am I to judge? If a person is a good person and seeking after God, then who am I to judge? Now, I was told by the Catholic lawyer friend in Argentina that that was an old Jesuit trick, that a Jesuit asked a question will always answer the question with a question. So the Pope was asked, well, what do you think? And he said, who am I to judge? Question mark. But after that, in a number of encounters, the Pope, you may remember, went to Chile, where there had been a lot of cases of child abuse, as of course there were in Australia and as there have been in many countries. And a victim of the child abuse came up to him and said he couldn't cope with the animosity in his church. And the Pope said, you have to accept yourself. You have to accept yourself. God loves you the way you are. The Pope loves you the way you are. You must learn to love yourself the way you are. Now, all of that would have been a relatively insignificant statement in today's world, with the knowledge we now have of the science and all the work of Kinzie and Hooker and others. That would be an inconsequential statement. But in the context of the Roman Catholic Church, it was a very significant statement. The Pope loves you, and you must learn to love yourself. So when we were told that the Pope would be open possibly to making a statement that it was not necessary to Catholic doctrine to criminalise gay sex, leave aside wider questions, leave aside the question of gay marriage, leave aside anti-discrimination law, leave aside everything else but criminalising sex, that may be something the Pope would be willing to do. Armed with that intelligence, the International Bar Association elected to send a very high-level delegation to see Pope Francis, and we were told the Pope will receive you in private audience. So a group of 50 people from all over the world who are members of the IBA, the International Bar Association, and the Human Rights Institute decided to go to Rome. And they asked me to go to Rome, to the private audience with the Pope, because of the fact that I have identified myself as homosexual, as gay. And therefore they thought it was not good enough to have a lot of straight people there talking about it. It was good to have straight people and allies and people with children and families, but it was not enough. There should be someone who was gay speaking to the very heart of the Roman Catholic Church in Rome. And so I said I would be honoured to go, and I was given my ticket, and I was actually in my office just about to go to Sydney Airport when I got a phone call from the Argentinian lawyer saying, the Pope has backed out of the audience. Some people think there's too much danger of disagreement with him doing that, but he has assigned it to the highest official in the Vatican, the Cardinal Archbishop, who is the Cardinal Secretary of State of the Holy See. And his name is Pietro Cardinal Lanorin. And there we are in the basement of St. Peter's, Rome. It is, of course, a huge establishment. I asked myself, is it still worth going if I'm not going to see the Pope? It's an awful long way to go across the world from Australia. And the president of the IBA from Brazil said, I'm not going to just see a cardinal. I was expecting to see Pope Francis. I'm calling it off. But I did what I always do in situations of this kind. I rang up my partner. My partner has put up with me for 50 years. And in fact, earlier this year, on the exact anniversary, to the day, to the hour when we met, 50 years on, we got married. And there's the ring to show it. And my partner, Johan, said, you should still go. You have an opportunity to go into the very centre of the Roman Catholic Church. It is a place of huge influence on people and their faith and their beliefs all around the world, and you must not forfeit the opportunity to speak truth to power. And I think he was right. But in any case, I took his advice. I got on the train, I went out to the airport, I got on the plane, I went that long distance that we Australians know, and at midnight, the plane deposited me in Rome. A taxi driver who definitely was mad, either mad or intoxicated, took me straight in at a huge speed into Rome. And when I was brave enough to open my eyes, I saw those magnificent pillars, Bellini's pillars, all around the St. Peter's Square in Rome, and the little hotel named for Pope Paul VI is in that area. And so I went there, and the next day saw the Cardinal. And he was addressed by Baroness Helena Kennedy, who is this head of the Secretariat of the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute. And she made a powerful statement about how what was said by the church would be so helpful. She revealed that she is herself Catholic. She revealed that the teachings of the Catholic Church emphasize the importance of the inherent dignity of everybody, and to respect the inherent dignity of everybody, you're not going to require that people be criminalised for being who they are. And the lawyer from Argentina made his statement, and he said he was brought up by the Catholic Church, and the problem was that in Latin America, in none of the countries that had a Spanish legal system or a Portuguese legal system was it criminalised. Only in the old British Empire, in the Caribbean. And there it was impeding the struggle against HIV, because you couldn't reach out to people because they couldn't identify, because if they did, they would be liable to be imprisoned and punished. And so he appealed for the thing to be changed. And so then it was my turn. And I thought I should, out of candour, start by saying, unlike Baroness Kennedy and Leo Radzinovich from Argentina, I am not Catholic. I was brought up in the simple faith of the Anglican Church in Australia. And for the first time, I saw a smile come across the face of the Cardinal Secretary of State. He found it amusing that I should make the point, even in the centre of the Catholic Church, that what was done there is of relevance, not just for Catholics, but for Christian people and people of faith everywhere, and therefore that the leadership of Pope Francis on this thing would be very important. And after telling him of the pain and the sorrow of growing up with a secret, a big, dark secret that I couldn't share with my parents, I couldn't share with my grandmother, I couldn't share with my siblings, my sister, my brothers, and how it's very wrong to impose that obligation of false shame about something you do not choose and cannot change, that I hope that Pope Francis would find a way to make a statement that this is no longer necessary, and as in France, as in Spain, as in Portugal, as in Russia, as in China, those laws should be got rid of. And at the end of the dialogue, the Cardinal Secretary of State said, I think there's a lot of common ground between what you have said and what is the doctrine of the Catholic Church. And I will report to Pope Francis, and I hope that we can continue this dialogue, and I hope that that will lead to some steps by the Holy Father to make clear and clarify the position of the Catholic Church. Now, it would be nice at that point to finish on a happy note. But as we all know, life's journey is full of clouds. We need a few more clouds in the sky here at the moment. Clouds and thunder and lightning before you get to the sunshine. And in June of this year, the Congregation on Catholic Education in Rome issued a statement which is titled, Male and Female, He Created Them. And this statement is a very strong statement condemning the idea of gender fluidity or sexual fluidity. It's mainly a statement against trans people. It's not so much a statement about gay people, but it's not friendly, and it doesn't involve consultation or dialogue with the people most affected, the trans and the gay people. It has involved dialogue with theologians, with philosophers, with church historians and other experts, but not with the people who can tell of the real life experience of the tears on the pillows as children coming to terms with their actuality. It says in a way that is common, as I've seen in a lot of Catholic publications, you must have no bullying and there must be no unkindness and nor any discrimination, but we cannot condone any variation in the gender that is stamped on people by their body parts. This is the so-called theory of complementarity. It's a natural law theory that because people have a penis or a vagina, you've heard the joke, haven't you? Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Because of the body parts, you're stuck with that for life, even though the science now shows that some people with the body parts can get by perfectly well in their lives, in intimacy and in love and kindness and friendship and loyalty, even though they don't have perfectly complementary body parts. Human beings are very strange and wonderful people, and their consciousness, their capacity to think things through, to have rational thought, is part of the great gift. If you're a believer, you believe this is, in a sense, that God set us free. But some people don't think there is full freedom. So that is where we stand at the moment in the dialogue with Rome, but the dialogue does continue. This issue is becoming of a little significance for us in Australia because of the demands that are now being made for legal protection of so-called religious freedoms. I'm not going to mention a particular case because the case is before the courts or before a tribunal, but the demand is being made that we should have religious protection for religious people to say what they believe is their religion. And most Australians, being a rather relaxed people, and in particular being a people which, according to our census, is increasingly becoming non-religious. In the last census, 31% of Australians responded that they had no religion. And that has grown at an enormous speed in the last 20 years. And there are some people in our what it says, and that's part of their religious freedom. And most of us would think, well, within reason, people should be able to say what their religion teaches them. But there are two problems. The first problem is that in the Bible, there are passages that can please everyone and no one. There's a particular passage in St. Matthew's Gospel of the New Testament, and it's in a passage where St. Matthew is explaining what happened at the time of just before the crucifixion of Jesus. You remember the point where Pilate asked Jesus, "Do you really say you're the King of the Jews?" And he said, "'Tis true, I am the King." And Pilate then says to the assembly, "I find no fault with this just man." And they scream out, "Crucify him, crucify him. We have no king but Caesar." And Pilate sends for the bowl of water, washes his hands, and says, I find no fault with him. If you won't take Barabbas, I hand him to you under the tradition that you can deal with him yourself, but you have to deal with him. I'm not condemning him. And then comes a passage. It's a very important passage in the Bible. And it's a passage that says that the Jews then said, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." I'll repeat that. "Let his blood be on us and on our children." And it's that passage in St. Matthew's Gospel that was the foundation of the antipathy of the Christian churches against the Jews, and the foundation in Europe of anti-Semitism, of the prayers at Easter for the perfidious Jews, and for attacks on Jewish property, the pogroms, and the period of the Nazis and the Holocaust. Let his blood be on us and on our children, on the Jewish children. And so in the Bible you can find passages that support hate. And that's the first problem. The second problem is, in Australia, unlike virtually every other country, certainly in the English-speaking world, we don't have a Bill of Rights. We don't have a Bill of Rights that protects the rights of the young, the rights to education, the rights to life, the right to health, the right to information, the right to speak points of view which may not be agreed to by religious people. We don't have that. And the problem that is presented to us is, if we make protection for religious freedoms, who is going then to speak up for the other rights and the other freedoms? Where will the words be that judges and tribunals can find in order to counterbalance the rights of the religious? And this is very relevant because of the fact that one of the desires of religious people is to be able in schools to exclude young gay people, or to remove and exclude teachers who happen to be contained in the Ruddock inquiry into this issue, reveal that the levels of suicidal thoughts amongst gay people are 3 times higher in youth than amongst straight youth. And amongst trans, they're 11 times higher. And there are 18 times the chance that a trans person will actually commit suicide. And in particular, if they're told that their gender fluidity is totally opposed because their body parts don't permit it. They're stuck with their body parts and they should accept them. So this is how the issue that I've told you about, going back to the old passages of Scripture and how that seeped into the legal systems and then went out of most legal systems but hung around in the common law systems. How that then led ultimately to my going to the catacombs and meeting the Cardinal Secretary of State, and the dialogue began, but then the message of the report of the Congregation on Catholic Education, and how we in Australia are looking at the issues of religious freedoms. All of these are a story, and a story whose ending we don't yet know. But surely we're going to hear more about the chapters both at the level of Rome and at the level of Canberra in the weeks to come. And that's what I've come to Armidale today to tell you about. And I hope it will have a happy ending, but I'm not sure that it will have a happy ending. And we can solve our Australian ending in the democratic way. But how it will be solved in the councils of the Roman Catholic Church, only Pope Francis and his colleagues and the Holy See in Rome will ultimately reveal. That's it.